Chapter 8. After breakfast the following morning, Susan sat down with just Albert at the table. She'd let him slide on the absolute obedience rule as he'd gotten used to her, and she couldn't let that happen any longer. Albert sat back in his chair and glared at her, letting her know he didn't appreciate her presence in his house or her insistence they have another little talk. Susan cleared her throat before speaking. "I want you to know I've noticed you're not being obedient the first time I tell you to do things. I've been here for long enough now that you know you need to obey. I will start using consequences if you don't obey immediately the first time I tell you to do something. It doesn't matter whether or not you like me. I'm your mother now and I'm here to stay. You don't really expect me to do whatever you tell me to do you? I mean, you're not my real mom. You're just some girl my dad married." Susan took a deep breath, mentally counting to 10 before responding. "I'm the only mom you've got, and yes, I expect absolute obedience every time I say something. From now on, there will be consequences, and they will be swift. Is that understood? You can't make me do anything I don't want to do. I don't care what you say." He stood up quickly, tipping his chair over in the process. "Pick your chair up." There was no time like the present to assert her authority and make sure he knew he was going to obey. "No. You can't make me." He ran from the room and straight out the front door to the corral where he knew his father was spending the day working with the horses. Susan left the chair on its side and warned both Sadie and Mrs. Hackenschleimer not to fix it before she followed at a more sedate pace. She'd give Albert time to complain to David about her and tell her what a terrible stepmother she was before she made him do exactly what he'd been told to do. Asterisk. David looked up to see Albert running toward him, his face red with anger and his fists clenched. He probably had another run-in with Susan. When is he going to understand that she's not going to give up, and he's going to obey her or suffer her consequences? "I hate her, Pa. She's so mean to me. Why did you marry her?" Albert had angry tears running down his face and his voice was shaking. "She's mean to you? What has she done that's mean?" David's voice was calm. He wanted the boy to explain what Susan had done that was so terrible. He was certain she hadn't been mean in any real way, but she did tend to threaten to use a switch on the boys more than he would like. Albert took a deep breath, winded from his run from the house. "She said I have to do whatever she says whenever she says it. If I don't, she's going to punish me. She's your mother now. She has the right to expect obedience from you." David's voice was matter-of-fact, trying to let his son know he would back up Susan if necessary. "But she doesn't have the right to punish me." "What kind of punishment are we talking about?" "She doesn't have the right to spank you, but she has the right to do anything else necessary to get you to obey." David folded his arms over his chest to see what Albert would say about that. "She said if I don't obey the first time, I have to do what she told me to do 10 times. That's just stupid. Whether you think it's stupid or not, it's your job to do exactly what she says. Did she tell you to do something you didn't do?" Albert kicked at a clump of dirt on the ground, not meeting his father's eyes. "Well, I knocked over my chair by mistake, and she told me to pick it up, but I ran out here to you instead." David sighed. "Why didn't you just pick it up? Wouldn't that have made more sense? Especially if you knew you'd have to pick it up 10 times instead of 1 if you didn't? I just don't understand why I have to listen to her. She doesn't want me to have any fun anymore." "She doesn't? Didn't she let you have fun yesterday? Didn't she even encourage you to have fun by fixing a picnic lunch? And she certainly didn't stop you from joining the baseball game." Albert shrugged. "I guess. I think she does want you to have fun. She just wants you to have fun in a way that doesn't hurt others. She wants you to be well behaved in your fun." He knew at Albert's age, he'd have fought Susan's influence as hard as Albert was, but he needed his son to see she was there to help, not hurt. "I like things the way they were before she came here. Can't you send her back to Massachusetts?" David grinned despite all his efforts not to. No, I can't. I married her. You heard the judge. He said, till death do you part. That means I'll be married to her until one of us dies. And if I kill her, I'll just have to go to prison and never see you again, he added quickly before Albert suggested it. Well, I don't want you to go to prison. Good. Because even for you, I wouldn't kill my wife. I happen to like having her around. He saw Susan walking toward them. Squeezing Albert's shoulder, he said, it's time for you to face the music, son. Albert looked toward the house. I guess she's the music. David chuckled. She is right now. Well, she's definitely not a tune I like. When Susan reached them, she held her hand out for Albert's. Are you ready for your punishment? Albert looked down at his feet. I guess so, but do I have to hold your hand on the way back to the house? Susan nodded solemnly. It's part of the punishment. You have to talk to me, too. She knew Albert would rather do anything than hold her hand, so she made a big deal about holding hands with him, swinging their hands back and forth. David met her eyes and winked at her as he watched them walk back toward the house. He realized a little more every day just how incredible the woman he'd married was. Susan waited until they were out of earshot of David before saying, you know you broke the rule we were talking about during our conversation about it. Her voice portrayed just how silly she thought that was. Albert sighed and kicked at a weed in his path. I know. You know I'm going to punish you for it, right? Yes, ma'am. Do you remember the punishment for disobedience? As if he could forget the punishment when they'd just been talking about it. I have to do whatever I was told to do 10 times. His shoulders sagged as he said it. So I get to knock over a chair 9 times and pick it up 10? Susan shook her head. No, knocking over the chair is fun, so I get to do that part. You just have to pick it up 10 times, and set it right at the table. She did her best not to smile as she told him, because she didn't want him to think she was laughing at his punishment. You do know that's stupid, right? I tried to talk your pa into letting me take a switch to your bottom instead, but he said I couldn't. So I have to get creative with the stupid punishments. She grinned down at his bowed head. Would you rather I used a switch? That doesn't sound as stupid as picking up a chair 10 times. She laughed. It doesn't sound as stupid to me either, but your pa feels differently. She opened the door and waited while he preceded her into the house. He walked straight to the dining room and picked up the chair he'd knocked over. 1, he said with a groan. She bit her lip to keep from laughing as she knocked it over. He picked it up. 2. After he reached 10, she told him to go into his room for an hour and think about how things could be calmer around the house. After he'd stomped off to his room, she looked up and saw her audience. Sadie, Mrs. Hackenschleimer, Louis and the twins had all been watching. She shrugged at the older women. Well, that was fun. The sarcasm in her voice told the older women she thought it was anything but fun. Mrs. Hackenschleimer shook her head. That boy needs his bottom beaten. I don't think we're going to be able to convince David of that, Susan said with a sigh. Don't worry, though. It's all a game, and it's a game I'm going to win. Children in large families tend to be competitive, and I come from one of the biggest. She went back to the family parlor to make clothes that weren't identical for the twins. Asterisk. During dinner that evening, David was amazed at the difference in his boys. They were all demonstrating the kind of table manners they'd had for Susan's first visit to their house. The twins were even eating with their spoons more and less with their fingers. His eyes met Susan's across the length of the long table. He gave her a slight smile, trying to communicate the difference he saw and how pleased he was about it without bringing it to the attention of the boys. He was truly amazed at how much better all of his boys were behaving after less than a week. He prayed it wasn't just the calm before the storm. So what did everyone do today? He asked. Albert sighed. I spent some time in my room thinking about my behavior, and then I found the perfect tree for the treehouse you said you'd help me build. When can we get started? David was surprised Albert even remembered the promise. It had happened before the twins were born and Albert hadn't mentioned it since. David studied his oldest son. Did he truly understand how difficult life had been for him as a single parent, but now things would be easier because of Susan? It's going to be a while. I have 3 colts I'm training right now, and each one is needed as soon as possible. That means 10-hour days 6 days a week for a while. Albert pushed his peas around on his plate, obviously annoyed by what his father had said. Susan had a thoughtful look on her face for a moment before saying, I could help you, Albert. I helped my younger brothers build a tree house when I was around your age. Albert stared at her in disbelief. But you're a girl. Susan hid her grin as she shrugged. I am. I'm also really good with a hammer and saw. She looked at David. How soon could you get us some lumber? I can request it tomorrow and we could have it by Wednesday. Would it be okay with you if your ma helped with it instead of me? He held his breath waiting for the answer. This would be such a good way for Susan and Albert to come to terms with one another. Albert seemed to think about it for a minute. She wouldn't be allowed in it after she was done, because she's a girl. Susan shook her head looking very solemn. Oh, of course not. I would never dream of going in there when it was finished. I'll just help you build it and make sure it's safe. She looked at Louis, who was squirming in his chair with excitement. You'd help, too, wouldn't you, Louis? Yes. The single word was shouted in his excitement. David hid a chuckle as he watched his wife endear his boys to her. Walter looked down at Susan. Twee house. Susan nodded. Now you boys are too little to climb up in the treehouse, but when we're done with the treehouse, maybe our building team could build a fort for you. Fort? Thomas asked. Do you know what a fort is, Thomas? Thomas shook his head, his eyes wide with wonder. Susan directed her attention to both Thomas and Walter when she told them. It's a building for just the 2 of you to play in. No one else would be able to play in your special fort. We could keep blocks and trains in it for you. Twains? Walter asked. Susan nodded. Trains. Do you boys want a fort? Both Thomas and Walter nodded their heads before returning their attention to their dinner. Susan met David's eyes. That's settled then. If you'll get us some wood, the boys and I will start building the treehouse on Wednesday. Albert looked slightly disappointed that he'd be helped by Susan and not David, but he wasn't going to quibble because he wanted to have his treehouse as soon as he could. Will you, Pa? David nodded. I'll order it tomorrow. He could get one of the ranch hands to build it for them, but knew it would be a better experience for the boys, and for Susan, to build it themselves. He hoped this would make Albert feel less animosity toward his new stepmother. The excitement around the table was palpable. All 4 boys were glowing at the idea of building places to play, and Susan looked as if she was relieved she'd finally found a way to get through to Albert. Asterisk. After dinner, Susan put the little boys to bed, and when she came down the stairs she found David at the table with a pencil and paper and the boys ordering him to draw something. David's eyes met hers. They want me to help them design the treehouse, but I'm not good with drawing. Do you have any idea how to draw a treehouse? Susan had always been a decent artist. I can try. She took the paper and pencil from David and sketched a tree with lots of leaves and several branches that would work for building a treehouse. Is this the kind of tree we have to work with? She had seen a similar tree not far from the house, but not all the way to the corral, and thought that might be the one Albert was talking about. Albert looked and nodded slowly. That's the tree. The one that's almost to the corral. I know which one you mean. I thought that might be it. She drew a few rectangles spaced about a foot apart along the trunk as footholds for the boys to use as they climbed to the treehouse. We'll pound these in first to make it easier for us to get up there. She drew a large flat base along the top of the lowest branches of the tree. Now, do you want walls, or should we just build several platforms to give you a several-story treehouse? Albert and Louis walked into the parlor and Susan and David could hear them whispering, but Susan couldn't make out what they were saying. Can we have both? Albert asked. Susan shrugged. Is that okay with you? She asked David. You're buying the lumber. Having walls would cost more, of course, but she didn't think David would quibble over extra boards. I don't see why not. It'll take longer to build, though. The four of them worked on planning out the treehouse until late into the night. By the time they went to sleep, Susan had a drawing of what the boys wanted for their treehouse, complete with curtains. Boy curtains, Louis insisted. No flowers. They're too girly. Are you sure you want to do this? David asked as he climbed into bed and pulled her into his arms. It's a big project to take on. Susan smiled. Some of my best memories of being Albert's age were the hours and hours my brothers and sister and I spent working on the treehouse. Of course, we didn't have an adult directing the project, and when it was done it looked like it had been built by someone who had over-imbibed in liquor, but we were so proud of it. My younger brothers and sisters still play in it. David smiled, trailing a finger down her bare stomach. Well, if you want to do it, I certainly won't complain. He kissed her cheek. I can't believe how much better the boys are already behaving. It's like the difference between night and day. I know. I've been happy with them. She traced her finger along his lips. I'm going to have to hurry if I want to get the twins' new outfits done tomorrow. He frowned. Why are you making the twins' new outfits? I thought they had plenty of clothes. Oh, they do. I just think they should be able to dress in non-matching clothes if they'd like. I have younger brothers who are twins, and they hated being forced to match. As soon as they were old enough to speak in complete sentences, they insisted they be allowed to wear things that weren't identical. I think all twins should have a choice. People had often suggested she and Elizabeth should dress alike, and she'd hated the idea so much, she vowed she'd never do that to her children whether she had twins or not. They're only two. But they're developing their own individual personalities. They don't need to think of themselves as two halves of a whole. They're each people in their own right. Coming from a small family, he wouldn't think about being lumped in with her siblings like she did. People would hear her last name was Miller and step back saying, one of the demon horde. The boys didn't need to be lumped together that way. He shrugged. I guess. If they want to continue to dress alike, they'll have plenty of clothes to be able to do that. I just think they should have a choice. She wanted him to see her point of view, but he seemed to have lost interest. Whatever you say, he whispered as his lips went to her neck. Remember you said that. No words were needed for a long time after that. Chapter 9. Susan spent the following day sewing. She left the boys to Mrs. Hackenschleimer and went to the formal parlor where she knew the boys wouldn't go to play and just sewed as quickly as she could to get the new outfits ready for Walter and Thomas. Just before noon, Mrs. Hackenschleimer sought her out. Have you seen Albert and Louis? She asked. Susan's eyes met hers. I've been here sewing all day. Are they with David? Both boys enjoyed watching David work with the horses and often spent their mornings sitting atop the corral fence observing the methods he used to break the horses. I haven't checked yet, but I don't think so. Susan bit her lip, wondering if the nanny was just being overprotective or if there was a real problem. They often spend the entire morning outside, don't they? Yes, they do, but they come into the house by now asking when lunch will be. Those boys are driven by their hunger. They never stay out past 11 because they're so hungry they try to beg for food from Sadie. She's the one who realized they were missing. Susan set down her sewing and stood. I'll go check with David. She hurried out the door and to the corral. As she got close, she realized the boys weren't with him. She felt her heart jump into her chest as she broke into a run to talk to him as quickly as she could. David. He turned, smiling at first, but quickly losing the smile as he saw the panicked expression on her face. What's wrong? Have you seen Albert and Louis? I thought they were with Mrs. Hackenschleimer this morning, and she thought they were with me. I was sewing, though, and I haven't seen them since breakfast. David's brows drew together in confusion. I saw them this morning walking down the road. They said you told them they could walk over to the neighbor's house because they have new kittens. Susan shook her head. They didn't mention kittens to me at all. Which way did they go? She squinted toward the road, hoping she would see them walking back. Toward town. He took her by the elbow and led her to the stable. Calling out to one of the men close by, he yelled, "Saddle a horse and hitch up the buggy." He turned to Susan. Can you drive the buggy? Of course. She'd done enough plowing that driving a buggy was an easy task. Okay, I'll ride straight into town and look around for them there. You go to the neighboring ranches and ask around about them. Do you know if anyone has new kittens? She shook her head. If I'd heard about them, I'd have talked to you about getting one for the boys. I know they really want a cat. She was feeling more panicked by the minute. Why would the boys lie about her saying they could do something? His horse was saddled and he mounted with one lithe motion. If you find them, come right back here, and I'll do the same. If you don't find them, meet me back here in 3 hours. He looked down at her, his eyes concerned. If neither of us have found them in a couple of hours, we'll start a search party. She swallowed hard and got into the driver's seat of the buggy without waiting for assistance. 3 hours. She drove toward town, but pulled in at the first neighbor's house, while he raced past her into town. She talked to 6 neighbors before she gave up to meet David at the ranch. No one had seen the boys. No one knew of any new kittens. The boys had obviously made the story up to do something they knew they weren't supposed to be doing. As she was pulling into the driveway, she saw David on the horse with both boys riding in front of him. David's face was serious. She jumped down from the buggy and ran over to the horse waiting until David dismounted and helped the boys down before saying anything. Where were you two? Albert shrugged, avoiding her gaze. Louis kept looking at his feet, obviously afraid to answer. David put his hand on Albert's shoulder. Tell her where you were. Albert pulled away, looking up at David. But she'll punish us, Pa. David's eyes met Susan's and she realized then whatever they'd done, it was serious. Where were you? She kept her voice calm, but she was screaming inside. She was half afraid of what the answer would be and the other half was furious that they'd frightened her the way they had. Albert and Louis exchanged a look before Louis said, Well, we wanted to start the treehouse sooner, so we went to town to see if we could get some lumber. Susan put her fists on her hips, mentally counting to 5 before responding. How were you planning on getting the lumber home once you found it? How were you going to pay for it? Albert looked up at her earnestly. We had a plan. We still have the money Pa gave us to be good the night you came out to see if you wanted to marry him and had dinner with us. Susan's eyes flew to David and narrowed. He'd bribed his sons to help him deceive her? We figured $2 whole would be enough to buy lumber and have someone deliver it and bring us back to the ranch. Louis continued the story for Albert. Well, then we got lost, and we ended up in the acre, and that's where Pa found us, but we didn't mean to be in the acre, Ma. I swear. Susan closed her eyes, filled with fury. The acre? Your Pa found you in the acre? Her eyes darted back and forth between the two boys. Albert hung his head. Yes, ma'am. So let me get this straight. First of all, you lied to your Pa. Then you went into town without permission, not letting anyone know where you were really going. And worse than that, you went to the acre? Where your uncle was killed 3 weeks ago. Her eyes met David's. Am I hearing all this correctly? David nodded, his eyes filled with fear. She wasn't sure if he was afraid for what could have happened to the boys or what kind of punishment she had in store for them or for how furious she must be with him for bribing the boys to deceive her in the first place. Albert and Louis, I'd like you to go up to your room and sit on your beds. I don't want you to speak or even look at each other. I'll be up in a few minutes after I've had a chance to talk to your father. Her mind raced about what to do about the boys, but then she shut it down. She'd figure that out after she decided what to do with the man who'd paid his sons to help him deceive her. Both boys turned and ran toward the house, obviously thankful for what they saw as a reprieve for the punishment they knew was coming. Susan turned to David. You bribed your sons to be good so I'd agree to marry you? She walked toward him utterly furious. She poked him in the middle of the chest and he backed up a step. I'm sorry. I know it wasn't the right thing to do, but I saw you and knew you had to be my wife. You're so pretty. That's a bunch of hogwash and you know it. You already told me you were planning to ask me to marry you before you ever saw me. You deliberately deceived me to get me to take on those monsters you call sons. Her voice was low, but filled with fury. She was so angry, she didn't think she'd be able to yell at him until she calmed down. David continued to back away from her. He'd seen angry women before, but he'd never known one to be as angry as Susan was at that moment. She looked ready to chew him up and spit him out. I'm sorry. She closed her eyes fighting her anger. If he'd been one of her brothers, she'd have punched him in the eye without thinking twice about it. She was determined to resolve this without violence though. I agree with you. You are sorry. He backed up once more until he felt his horse against his back. I can't back up anymore, Susan. I've never wanted to hit anyone in my life as much as I want to hit you right now. She mentally counted to 10 and opened her eyes. Your boys need a switch taken to them for lying and for going into town without permission. I'm not even going to start on the acre. He shook his head. I just can't agree with beating them. There's got to be another solution. Your mother never beat you and look what happened. She shook her head. I'm getting off track here. We need to concentrate on the boys. If I can't spank them, you have to stand aside and let me do whatever I want to punish them without hitting. She glared up at him, leaving him in no doubt of how angry she still was. Agreed. He nodded. At that point, he would have agreed to anything as long as she turned her anger away from him. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we delay starting the treehouse for a day. They get no dessert tonight, and they spend tomorrow cleaning out the stalls. No dessert? Make sure Sadie fixes something they don't like. Her eyes widened. You're kidding me, right? I'm going to go tell Sadie to fix all of their favorite desserts in one night. They will not feel like this punishment is easy. How could his automatic thought be for making the punishment easier? What was wrong with him? He nodded, afraid to do anything else at that moment. Are you sure they should muck out the stalls? That's what the ranch hands are for. It was all she could do not to kick the man. What was he thinking? The boys needed a real punishment to keep them from doing the same thing again next week. She took a deep breath and folded her arms across her chest, just then realizing he was cowering against the horse. Good. He needs to realize I'm angry, and I mean business. I will punish them how I see fit, or I will switch them. Take your pick. She knew her voice sounded gravelly and harsh, but at that moment she didn't care. It was all she could do to speak to him without resorting to violence. Do what you want as long as you don't spank them? Fine. I will. She marched off toward the house and went straight to the kitchen, feeling his presence behind her but refusing to acknowledge him. Sadie, what are the older boys' favorite desserts? Her eyes were flashing fire as she asked the housekeeper the question. Sadie turned with a gleam in her eye, knowing very well where this was going after the uproar when the boys disappeared earlier that day. Albert likes chocolate cake and Louis prefers blueberry pie. Do you have the ingredients to make both for dinner tonight? The more they loved the dessert, the worse the punishment would feel. Sadie nodded. I do. Please make them. Sadie grinned. Are the boys going to bed with no dessert? They are. Among other punishments. Sadie's eyes met David's over Susan's shoulder. Not going to argue with her? The laughter in Sadie's eyes was tangible. Susan turned and glared at him. He shook his head quickly. No, ma'am. I've got more sense than that. Sadie chuckled. Looks like you and your boys have met your match, David. She turned back to the stove where she was fixing a thick stew for dinner. Do either of you need something to eat? You missed lunch. David shook his head. No, the boys and I stopped at a restaurant on our way back from town. Susan turned and stared at him. You what? He shrugged, realizing he'd said the wrong thing. Well, we were all hungry, and we missed lunch and all. Susan couldn't help herself. At that point, she pulled her leg back and kicked him in the shin as hard as she possibly could. She could not take another second of his ridiculous parenting methods. They wander around Hell's Half-Acre and you reward them by taking them to a restaurant? What on earth is wrong with you? She made a shooing motion with her hand. Get out. Go and play with the horses or do whatever nonsense you do all day. I don't need you here mollycoddling the boys while I'm punishing them. You make me crazy. She lifted her foot to kick him again as he turned and limped out of the kitchen as fast as he could. She turned to Sadie. You've known him his whole life. Was he always this stupid? She wanted to scream. She wanted to take a portrait of the man and hang it on a tree so she could throw axes at it. He should be the one she punished, not the boys. Sadie was laughing so hard she couldn't respond. She fixed a ham sandwich with leftovers from lunch for Susan and handed it to her. Susan sat down at the table in the kitchen and ate the sandwich, grumbling under her breath the whole time. I married a crazy man. He belongs in an asylum. He should not be free to roam around the world. Sadie watched her while she took out the ingredients she needed to make the desserts the boys wouldn't be allowed to eat. Finally, Susan finished eating and put her plate in the sink. Now I have to go deal with his demented offspring. I never thought I'd say this, but I want to go back to Massachusetts and deal with the demon horde. At least there I was allowed to get the switch when the situation warranted it. She grumbled all the way out of the kitchen and up the stairs. She opened the door to the boys' bedroom and found them facing in opposite directions and not speaking just as she'd told them. Good. Maybe they learned something from this situation even if their idiot father didn't. First off, I want you to know that you had me frightened half to death this morning. You have been my sons for less than a week, and I thought I'd lost you forever. What on earth were you thinking going off on your own into Fort Worth that way? You could have been shot or killed. Both boys hung their heads. I'm sorry, Ma, Louis whispered, obviously contrite. We were just trying to help everything get started faster. I'm sorry. Albert looked up at her as he said the last words. What's our punishment? She looked between the two of them, utterly fed up with the entire situation. I wanted to go pick a switch and beat you both with it. She needed them to know that her first inclination was to spank them. Albert's eyes grew wide. Teacher does that at school sometimes. Good for teacher. Susan said emphatically. Your father doesn't want you spanked though. I have no idea why, because I can't think of two boys in this world who deserve a spanking more than the two of you do right now. She walked over to look out the window, glaring down at David, who was back to working with the horses. You're going to go to bed with no desserts tonight. Albert let out a huge sigh of relief. He'd obviously expected more. And you'll spend the rest of the day today, and all day tomorrow, cleaning the stable. She turned back to the boys so she could watch their reaction to her pronouncement. But that's what the ranch hands do, Albert said reasonably. Yes, it is, and that's too bad. I'd have told them to stop their work for a week if I'd known I'd have to use it as a punishment for you. She thought the boys needed to have real chores anyway. How would they ever learn to be responsible if they were able to play all the time and never work? Louis looked up at her, his bottom lip quivering. Does that mean we don't get to start building the treehouse tomorrow? It absolutely means no treehouse tomorrow. We'll start Thursday if I get a report that you work hard today and tomorrow. Louis wiped away a tear that was coursing down his cheek at the idea of putting the treehouse off for an extra day. Yes, Ma. Albert stood up and grabbed his brother by the arm. Come on. We need to take our punishments like men. He pulled his brother along behind him. Susan followed them both down the stairs and out the front door. Instead of going straight to the stable, they first went to their father and said something to him, and then went to the stable. She was certain they'd gone to complain over their punishment, but she was happy to see David backed her up. She had no idea what she was going to do with David. Is he too old to take a switch to? Asterisk. David stood staring at the boys after they left him to go clean out the stalls. When they'd come toward him, he was sure they were coming to complain about their punishment, and he was going to find a way to sneak around Susan and go easier on them. Instead, their purpose in coming to see him was apologizing for causing him worry. He couldn't believe it. Why hadn't they asked him to not have to muck out the stalls? When he went into the house for dinner, he found Susan in the formal parlor finishing up some sewing for the twins. Those look nice, he commented. She grunted but didn't say anything, so he assumed she was still angry with him for several different reasons. He sighed and went upstairs to change for dinner. He didn't want to stay in a room with a wife who was obviously furious with him, for good reason, he had to admit. He'd really messed things up, and wondered what he'd have to do to get her to forgive him. When he went down the stairs after changing, he saw Albert and Louis with Susan. She'd finished her sewing and had laid it aside, and the boys were apologizing to her. He couldn't believe his ears. Had she told them they had to apologize? Susan hugged both boys to her. Thank you for saying you're sorry to me. I want you to know that I understand you just want to have fun. I want you to have fun. But you have to do it in a way that's safe for you and for other people. Running around town without anyone knowing where you are is not safe. Anything could have happened to you. Albert pulled away. We know you're just trying to keep us safe, Ma. Thanks for caring about us. David was shocked. Surely now she'd tell the boys they could have their desserts back and they didn't have to spend the next day mucking the stalls. He waited for a minute for her to say so, but she didn't. He stepped into the parlor. You boys have obviously learned your lesson. I think you can have your desserts tonight, and you don't have to finish up the horse stalls tomorrow. Albert looked surprised and turned to Susan. Is that true, Ma? Susan shook her head. I can tell you've learned your lesson, but you need to understand there are consequences for everything you do. You'll finish up your punishment, and then everything will be back to normal again. She ruffled both boys' hair. Go wash up and change your clothes for dinner. As soon as they boys were out of the room, she stood up glaring at David. They've learned their lesson. Why can't you just end the punishment now? David was surprised she was clinging to a punishment for a lesson they'd obviously already learned. Because if I stop their punishment every time they come to me and apologize and hug me, they'll do that as soon as they've done something wrong and realize they can get away with anything. They need structure in their lives, and cutting off their punishment is not structure. She took a deep breath, obviously searching for self-control. I would appreciate it if you would consult me before rescinding any punishment I give in the future. They need to see us as unified when it comes to discipline. If I decide to stay here, I need you to back me up every step of the way. His eyes widened in shock. What do you mean if you decide to stay? She wasn't seriously thinking about leaving him, was she? They hadn't even been married for a week. Just that. I found out today my husband deliberately deceived me, and it's obvious he's trying to undermine me with our boys. I won't stay in a marriage where that continues. She walked past him into the dining room where Sadie was serving the stew she'd made with some homemade biscuits. She took her seat at the foot of the table while Mrs. Hackenschleimer brought the twins to their high chairs. Thanks for all your help today, Mrs. Hackenschleimer. The nanny nodded and started toward the kitchen. Is that all for the night? Yes, I'll put them to bed after dinner. David watched the whole exchange, still feeling shocked to his core. Was his wife going to leave him? Christian wives didn't just leave their husbands over something little. What was she thinking? He watched as Albert and Louis took their seats before taking his own. He calmly prayed over the meal and they all ate. Albert and Louis seemed happier than they'd been in a long time. How was that possible? They were being forced to carry out a severe punishment. How could they be happy? David didn't understand anything that was going on around him. Whatever was happening with his boys was beyond his understanding. Did they want to be disciplined? Caroline had told him more than once that children like structure, but did that mean they were happier when they were punished? It didn't make sense at all. When Sadie brought out their favorite desserts, both boys looked sad, but they never reached for a piece knowing they wouldn't get them. Neither boy complained. David wanted to give them each a piece because of their sad looks, but he didn't want to lose his wife, and he was afraid he'd already done that. He sighed. Why did the boys seem to think her decisions were good while they ignored his? Susan put Thomas and Walter to bed immediately after dinner. When she came down the stairs afterward, she told the older boys to take baths and wash their hair. Do you need me to help you with your hair, Louis? I'll help him, Ma. I don't mind. Albert smiled at Susan as if she'd granted him a favor that day instead of depriving him of one of his favorite things. Susan nodded at Albert. That would be good. Thanks for helping your brother. She calmly walked into the family parlor as if Albert offered to help do things for his younger brothers every day and plucked a book off the shelf. She was sitting quietly reading when David walked into the room, still flabbergasted about what he'd seen. He sat next to her on the couch, and she stood and moved to the overstuffed chair in the corner of the room. May I ask you something? David asked cautiously. Susan gave a quick nod, but didn't look up from her book. Why are the boys acting as if you've given them some sort of gift when all you did was punish them today? She put her open book against her belly, and her eyes met his for the first time since their confrontation before dinner. He could see the anger still seething in her green eyes, and hoped she got over her mad before bed that night. He was half afraid he'd wake up with a knife at his throat. Children like structure. They like knowing what the rules are and what the consequences will be when they break the rules. It makes them feel safe to know there are rules in place, especially when they understand why the rules are there. After they've broken a rule, they feel lost until someone punishes them, and then they feel better about it again. You really believe that, don't you? With everything inside me. I'm not just trying to be mean to the boys. I want them to be well behaved, yes, but I also know they'll be happier if they have the structure I'm creating. Sure, they enjoy running around like crazed heathen children, but they prefer to follow a structure. David sat back and thought about what she'd said. The boys seemed, by their behavior, to be telling him she was right. Even Albert was becoming helpful and obedient. Are you really thinking about leaving me? He regretted the question as soon as he'd asked it. He didn't want her to realize just how her threat had made him feel. He couldn't go back to the way things had been before they'd married. He was relying on her too much already, and they'd only been married a few days. She sighed. I promised both my mother and the woman who runs the mail-order bride agency that sent me here that I wouldn't put up with being married to a man who mistreated me. I think they meant not to put up with a man who beat me, but I think bribing your boys to deceive me and contradicting my punishments is just as bad. I can't stay somewhere where that kind of treatment is a way of life. I won't. I respect myself too much for that. Her eyes met his again, the anger gone, but the serious look told him she wasn't joking about leaving. I don't want to leave. Now that the boys are mostly under control, it's pleasant here. I enjoy being married to you. I just can't allow any man to lie to me and get away with it. David groaned. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. I had no idea how strongly you felt about poorly behaved children, but that's no excuse. I just wanted to be married again and have help with them, but I shouldn't have done that to you or any other woman. Will you forgive me? His eyes were intense as they looked into hers, trying to determine just how angry she was. She nodded slowly. We'll start fresh, but now you know the kind of things I absolutely cannot tolerate. I do. Things will be better around here. I promise. Asterisk. Susan left explicit instructions with Sam, who was in charge of the stables, before she left for coffee with Beverly and Wilma the following afternoon. The boys needed to work continuously and not take more than one 15-minute break. Sam just nodded at her, obviously afraid to argue with her. He hitched the team to the buggy and watched as she drove off for coffee and cookies with her new friends. David had given her instructions in how to get to the neighbor's house, and she saw that Wilma was just getting out of her own buggy as she pulled up. Wilma. Susan called, waving to her friend. Wilma waited for Susan with a grin on her face. I'm so glad you and Beverly invited me today, Wilma said shyly. Susan linked her arm through the other woman's and led her to the door. Why is that? Wilma shrugged. I've kind of kept to myself over the years, and the friends I made in school all moved on without me. Now that I'm married, I'd like to be able to do things with other ladies, but I'm just not sure how to go about it. Susan smiled at her. Well, you've gotten started now. Next Wednesday we'll meet at my house at the same time, and maybe the following week the three of us can meet at your house. I'm sure we'll all be great friends in no time. She truly enjoyed being around Wilma. Wilma seemed extremely shy, and Susan knew that shy women did better when they had outgoing friends. Susan didn't have a shy bone in her body. Beverly opened the door before they had a chance to knock. Come in. I have the coffee and cookies all ready. Susan glanced around the house as she went in. It was as nicely furnished as the daily home, and she immediately wondered if Beverly had an indoor outhouse as well. She followed the other woman into the parlor and sat down on the couch. Where are your girls? Susan asked. She'd met the three girls at church on Sunday and had expected to see them again that day. Beverly smiled. I sent them into town to stay with their grandmother. She's been itching to have them for a day, and I thought we'd have more fun without them here. Susan relaxed against the back of the couch. Good. I could use an afternoon with no children. She rolled her head on her neck, feeling extremely comfortable with both of her new friends. Beverly looked over at her. You getting anywhere with those hellions? Susan nodded. I really think I am. Of course, Albert and Louis went to Fort Worth yesterday and got lost. They ended up in the acre. She said the words casually, knowing they'd have more impact that way. Wilma gasped. They're okay? We realized they were missing and went looking for them. I think I went to every ranch north of ours. She looked at Wilma. You must be south of us as well. We share a border with Beverly on her south side. Well, the two of them are at home mucking out the horse stalls. I wish David would let me spank them, but he's adamant. She stretched her arms above her head. It's hard being married to someone who feels as differently about discipline as David and I do. She shook her head as she thought about the arguments she'd had with David in the past week regarding discipline. Beverly nodded. I'm glad Charles and I don't have that problem. Of course, our girls are very well behaved. Susan nodded. Compared to my boys, most children are. They're improving, though. I just have to keep telling myself that. So how are you enjoying married life other than the boys? Wilma asked. Other than the boys and fighting over the boys, it's good. We do fight over them a lot more often than I like. Susan shrugged. I do enjoy being married though. David is a good husband for the most part. Beverly leaned forward. Do I sense trouble in paradise? A little. She wondered if it would be right to tell them what had happened, but decided she needed advice and the two of them were there. It would take a month to get a letter from back home if she wrote asking someone there for the advice she needed. I found out yesterday he paid the boys to be good the night I met them. He knew I wouldn't marry him if I saw how the boys really acted. Beverly's eyes widened and then her lips quirked. I know it was wrong and deceptive, but it's funny. Susan shook her head. The boys just casually mentioned the dollars he'd given them to be good so I'd marry him. I was so furious with him I threatened to leave him. Wilma hid her smile behind her hand. You haven't even been married for a week. You can't leave him. Oh, I could. But I won't. He does know now that I won't put up with that kind of nonsense. She picked up a sugar cookie and took a bite. Why couldn't he have simply said, my boys are hellions, but I think you could get them to act right in no time? Beverly gave Susan a knowing look. Would you have married him if he had? Susan shook her head with a laugh. Absolutely not. That's why he didn't say it then, Beverly said. Wilma smiled at Susan. I can't help but remember how bad David, Charles and Jesse were in school. Every time I turned around they were getting in trouble for something. Beverly looked at Wilma. What about Ned? Wasn't he part of it? Wilma blushed. Ned was too busy making eyes at me to get into trouble. We spent all of our recesses together even back then. Susan tilted her head to the side as she studied Wilma. Why did he join the army then? Why didn't he just stay here and marry you right after school? Wilma looked down at her hands. There was another boy who Ned thought I loved. We were just friends, and I was helping him to court another girl, but Ned saw us and thought there was more between us, so he joined the army. By the time he knew the truth, it was too late. He asked my pa if he could court me as soon as he came back, though. Wilma took a sip of her coffee. I think we're closer because of the years apart. I think it taught us just how much we cared for one another. We did write to one another as often as possible, but it just wasn't the same as being together. Susan sighed. I love good love stories like that. They spent the rest of the afternoon laughing and joking about the antics the men had pulled when they were boys and the problems Susan's boys were causing. Susan looked at Beverly just before she left. One day, one of my boys is going to marry one of your girls, and there's nothing you can do about it. Beverly leaned back and groaned. That's the last thing I need. Wilma laughed. I hope it happens. Beverly glared at Wilma. Then I hope you have a girl for one of her twins to marry. Wilma smiled at Susan. I wouldn't mind being related to Susan through marriage. They all laughed and agreed to meet at Susan's house the following week at the same time. Susan was happy to have made two such good friends so soon after she arrived. She and Wilma walked out to their buggies together. I'll see you Sunday, she called as she drove north toward her home. Wilma waved at her, looking much happier than she had when Susan had met her at their wedding. Susan was glad she'd reached out to the shy woman, because she firmly believed a good friend could make all the difference in the world. Chapter 10. Things around the ranch became easier to deal with as the time passed. She helped the boys build their treehouse, and then the three of them built a fort for the two younger boys. She made curtains and bought small rugs for the floors of the boys' structures. Once the fort was built, it seemed as if she never saw Albert or Louis anymore, because they spent their time in the treehouse, planning their takeover of Texas and then the world, although they did still hold the belief that Texas was the world. The twins enjoyed their fort, but didn't spend nearly as much time in it as the older boys spent in the treehouse, because either Susan or Mrs. Hackenschleimer had to be in the fort with them, and they'd picked up the idea of no girls allowed from their older brothers. They thought the women should stand outside the fort and watch them through the window, and neither of the women was willing to stand in the hot Texas sun to do that for long. David and Susan made peace with one another, and he deferred to her judgment when it came to disciplining the boys. She was still wary of him, and unsure of whether he was going to give her the full authority she needed to keep the boys in line, but she was certainly enjoying their marriage. Yes, the days were long, but the nights were wonderful. She loved being married to David. She often wondered if she'd have gotten bored being married to Jesse. Susan expected the temperature to cool off once September hit and the older boys started school, but the hot Texas sun just kept beating down on them. One Tuesday afternoon, toward the end of September, she was working on sewing some winter clothes for the twins. They did prefer to dress in different colors instead of always dressing alike, so she was trying to give them a variety of clothes to choose from. Baxter, their new kitten, was curled up on the couch next to her, hiding from the twins to catch a nap. Walter walked into the family parlor where she was doing her sewing and squatted down to play with his blocks. After a moment, she could smell his diaper, and looking up, she saw brown lines dripping down his legs. She made a face and set her sewing down, scooping him up and holding him at arm's length to take him to the bathtub, hoping she wouldn't get anything on her. As soon as she started the water in the bathtub, Mrs. Hackenschleimer came up behind her with Thomas on her hip. "Do you want me to do that?" Susan shook her head. "I can do it. Would you mind getting his dirty clothes to Sadie right away, though? And getting me some clean clothes for him?" Susan knelt beside the tub with Walter standing naked in his bath, giggling as she used a glass to dump water over his back and legs. Mrs. Hackenschleimer put Thomas down and told him to go play with the blocks in the family parlor before she left to do what Susan had asked. When she returned, Walter was sitting in the bathtub, splashing happily. He rarely got to take a bath without his brother, so Susan was letting him enjoy himself. After Mrs. Hackenschleimer set Walter's clean diaper and fresh clothes on the floor beside Susan, she said, "We need to talk about potty training these two. They're plenty old enough to be using the toilet like the rest of the family." Susan nodded. "I totally agree. I think I'll have the older boys take them outside and show them how to water the flowers they see. Albert and Louis won't like it, but they'll do it." Mrs. Hackenschleimer smiled as she leaned against the door jamb. "The difference you've made in those two older boys is simply amazing. They were hellions when I first arrived. They tried to hide it, because they were afraid of me, but I could see it. That first night you came, I wanted to warn you to run as fast as you could in the other direction, but I can see now, you're just what this family needed." Susan was surprised by the compliment from the older woman. Mrs. Hackenschleimer was always so serious and focused on her job. Susan hadn't realized she paid that much attention to what was going on in the family other than the twins. "Thank you. It's nice to hear someone has noticed. Everyone has noticed. You have worked wonders with the boys, and we're all happier for it." She glanced around and tilted her head to the side as if she was listening for a moment. "I don't hear Thomas." Susan glanced at her. "I'm sure he's just playing with the blocks like you suggested." Mrs. Hackenschleimer nodded. "Excuse me for a moment while I go check." She was back a few moments later. "He's not there. Why do we keep losing the boys?" Susan jumped up, knowing she could cover more ground looking for the child than Mrs. Hackenschleimer could. "You finish his bath. I'll go look for Thomas." She ran through the house calling the boy's name, but there was no response. She rushed into the kitchen, her eyes frightened. "Have you seen Thomas?" Sadie turned away from the chicken she was frying for dinner. "No, is he missing?" "Yes, we told him to play with the blocks while we were washing Walter. He's not anywhere in the house I can see." She hurried toward the door to the dining room. I'm going to go get David to help me look for him. She ran out of the house, calling Thomas's name. She checked in the fort, but he wasn't there. She couldn't see him anywhere. Running toward the corral, still calling his name, she saw David turn to her with a concerned look. Thomas is missing. We were giving Walter a bath and he was playing with blocks, and then suddenly he was gone. David noted the panicked look on his wife's face and pulled her into his arms. We'll find him. He called out to the nearest ranch hand that Thomas was missing, and the man ran to tell the others. How long has he been missing? Susan shook her head. Not more than 20 minutes. I'm so sorry, David. Tears were coursing down her face. I can't believe I've lost him. She should have paid more attention to Thomas than she had. She could have handled getting Walter's dirty clothes to Sadie and taken Walter upstairs naked. She'd done it before. Why had she asked Mrs. Hackenschleimer to put Thomas down? David took her hand and walked with her. Where's the kitten? I'm not sure. He was sleeping beside me on the sofa while I was sewing, but then Walter made a huge mess, leaking out of his diaper, and needed to be bathed right away. I didn't notice him again after that. He may still be sleeping in the family parlor. You run and check while I search all the outbuildings. He couldn't have gone far. His legs aren't long enough to cover much distance. David turned toward the pig pen first. He knew how much the twins enjoyed chasing the pigs now that Albert had taught them that game. Susan ran out of the house a few minutes later. Baxter is missing too. David nodded. I have a feeling we'll find the two of them together. They searched the stable, but he wasn't there. Sam said he hadn't seen any of the boys that day. Susan was terrified. The ranch was huge and anything could happen to Thomas on it. He was so small. What if he wandered into the corral and got kicked by one of the horses? Finally, they checked the barn, and there was Thomas, sitting in the corner playing with Baxter. Susan ran to him, picked him up and hugged him to her. Tears were coursing down her face, and she didn't care. She'd been so worried she'd lost him. Thomas pulled away after a moment. Mama, cry. He poked one of the tears with his finger. Susan gave a half laugh. I thought we lost you. I play with Kitty. His face made it clear he thought she was crazy to be so worried when he was just playing with the animal. She put Thomas back down. You can play with Kitty. She turned to David and saw him watching with a relieved smile. She walked into his arms and held him tightly. I thought we'd lost him. I'll never let him out of my sight again. She knew she was being melodramatic even as she said it, but she couldn't stop the words. How could she live with herself if something happened to one of them? David laughed. Of course, you will. He's fine. Susan shook her head. I don't know what I'd do if we lost one of our boys. Her voice was still shaking as she thought about what could have happened. David smiled, stroking her hair. Our boys? She nodded. Of course, they're our boys. Does that mean you're glad you married me? She laughed softly. Of course, I'm glad I married you. I have a man I couldn't live without, and 4 boys I love with all my heart. How could he not know that after 6 weeks of marriage? Didn't she show him every day how much she loved them all? David gave her a serious look. Is it only the boys you love? She smiled, stroking his cheek. Of course, it's not. I love you more than I ever dreamed I'd love anyone. I don't think I knew how much I loved all of you until Thomas went missing, though. It's amazing how losing a child puts everything in perspective. She looked over at Thomas looking so content as he played with the kitten giggling. I'm so glad, he whispered, kissing the top of her head. I think I fell in love with you when you got so mad at me on our wedding day. Susan laughed. So what you're saying is what you love most about me is my horrible temper? She thought about how she'd poked him in the chest and told him there was no way she'd share a bed with him. I wouldn't go that far. Susan took Thomas's hand before putting her arm around David's waist and walking toward the house. Well, if it's when you knew you loved me. She couldn't believe she felt good enough to tease him so soon after the crisis with Thomas. It was amazing what the words, "I love you," could do. I was just so glad to see you had spirit. So many women let men run all over them, and I'm so proud that you don't do that. She realized the older boys had made it home from school as she walked toward the house. Albert looked at her with a shocked look. You okay, Ma? You look like you've been crying. You never cry. Susan laughed self-consciously. Thomas wandered off and we couldn't find him. It really scared me. She knew Albert would worry if he didn't know exactly what had happened. Albert stared at her for a moment. Is that how you felt when Louis and I were missing that day? It is absolutely how I felt. I don't want anything to happen to any of you boys. She shook her head thinking back to her dread from that day as well. She'd never lost her siblings at home, but they didn't tend to wander, and when they did, they left a trail of destruction that was easy to follow. Does that mean you're going to stay? Susan's eyes widened in surprise. Of course I'm going to stay. Why would you think I wouldn't? Susan had no idea he was worried about her leaving them. Had he heard what she'd told David the day he and Louis had gotten lost in the acre? He shrugged and kicked a pebble. David took Thomas's hand and led him into the house. Well, my real ma left. And all the nannies left. Susan put her arm around Albert's shoulders and led him to the porch swing where they both Saturday your real ma left because she died. She didn't want to leave you. And the nannies left because you and your brother did mean things to them. Why did you do that? She knew she should be focused on his worries of her leaving, but since he was opening up to her, she really wanted to know their reasoning for being so mean to the different nannies. Albert shrugged. We didn't really want them here. Most of them just wanted to marry Pa. They didn't care about us. I do. Susan was sure he already knew it, but she told him anyway. I know, Ma. Albert rested his head on her shoulder. I'm glad you were the one who didn't leave. I'm not going anywhere. She was happy to be able to reassure him of that fact. She couldn't imagine life without her husband and boys. I love you and your brothers. I love you, too, Ma. They sat together silently for a few minutes, each of them happy the other was there. Finally, Susan asked, Are you hungry? Sadie was making fried chicken a while ago. I bet it's done. She knew fried chicken was his favorite meal. Albert stood up and offered her his hand to help her. Thank you, sir. She accepted his help gracefully and they went into the house together. Sadie was just putting dinner on the table. Mrs. Hackenschleimer stood beside the table wringing her hands together. I'm so sorry I lost him. I'll go pack my bags. Susan stared at her in disbelief. You can't abandon me now. She didn't want to think about doing it all alone without the older woman's help. Mrs. Hackenschleimer looked at Susan in surprise. You mean I'm not fired? Susan shook her head. Of course not. I need you. She walked over and hugged the older woman. You were the one who realized he was missing, which is why we found him so quickly. I don't know how long he would have been gone if you hadn't said something when you did. But I was the one who lost him in the first place. We lost him together. We were both focused on other things and weren't paying enough attention. She wasn't going to let the nanny take the full blame for something she'd done wrong as well. Mrs. Hackenschleimer nodded slowly. You still want me to stay? Absolutely. Who else is going to help me potty train the twins? Susan grinned at the nanny. You're done for the night, though. Go get your dinner. Thank you. Susan took her seat at the foot of the table. The boys sat in the exact same places they'd been in the first time she'd eaten with them, and she realized the meal was the same, too. So much had happened in the time she'd been in Texas, and she was thankful she had her family. She remembered then she was supposed to write Harriet a few weeks after the wedding and let her know everything was all right. She made a mental note to write to her first thing in the morning so she wouldn't forget. They all joined hands and David prayed over the food, thanking God that Susan was in their lives and that they'd found Thomas. Thomas still had no idea he'd caused such an uproar, but he liked hearing his name in the prayer. Susan turned to Louis. "So how was school today?" She'd found that asking Louis before she asked Albert was always a good thing. Louis tended to not only tell her everything Albert had done wrong during the day, but he happily told on himself as well. Albert was making faces at Ruby again. He had to stand in the corner. Susan looked at Albert. "Who's Ruby? Was there a girl in the boys' future? Wasn't Ruby one of Beverly's daughters?" Albert blushed. "Just a girl. Is she pretty?" Susan wiggled her eyebrows as she asked the question, knowing her teasing would embarrass him. He shrugged. "What's her last name?" She wasn't going to give up until she knew everything there was to know about the little girl he made faces at during school. Wilma had said that was how her relationship with Ned had started. "Smith." Susan looked at David. "Is Ruby Charles and Beverly's daughter?" She tried to keep the absolute glee from her voice as she asked the question. Beverly would be beside herself if something happened between Albert and her precious little Ruby. "Yes, she's their oldest." "Why?" Susan's smile lit up her entire face. She couldn't wait until Wednesday so she could torment her friend over the fact that Albert thought her daughter was pretty. "No reason." The smile didn't leave her face as she continued her meal, though. She and Wilma were going to have a lot of fun teasing Beverly. In bed that night, David asked Susan why she'd been so excited to know Ruby was Beverly's daughter. Susan laughed. "Beverly's convinced her perfect girls won't marry any of our hellions, and Albert thinks Ruby is pretty. She's going to have a fit when I tell her about it tomorrow." David grinned. "Charles won't be happy either. Let's have them over for dinner so we can watch them squirm when Albert looks at their girl." "Yes, let's." She sounded so excited at the prospect of watching their friend's discomfort he couldn't help but laugh. "You have an evil streak, wife. And you like it, husband." "Why yes. Yes, I do." He pulled her to him more tightly, loving even her mean streak. He would never have guessed when she stepped off the train just how well she fit in with his family. "It's why you love me." He chuckled. "It's only one of the many reasons I love you. Just so there's one." She snuggled into his side and rested her head on his shoulder. "I made the right decision marrying you." He hugged her closer. "I know you made the right decision for me and my boys." He'd known that since the first week they'd married. How had he been so fortunate? Our boys. Epilogue. January 5 of Sup /Sup, 1885. Dear Harriet. I was very happy to receive your letter yesterday. Things are still going very well for me here. I know I came to you determined that I didn't want to marry a man who had children, but I'm so glad things worked out the way they did. My boys make me smile every day. I can't imagine what life would be like without them. Thomas and Walter are potty trained now. I can't believe they'll be 3 next month. Albert is still sweet on our neighbor's daughter, little Ruby Smith. I tease her mother constantly about Albert being her future son-in-law. Louis is determined he's going to join the army to fight Indians as soon as he finishes school, and I pray every day he outgrows that notion. My life is so very different than what I pictured it would be when I left Beckham, but it's no less wonderful than I'd imagined. Thank you so much for helping me. I wish you every happiness in your future. If you ever need something from me, please don't hesitate to contact me. I think of you as one of my very dearest friends and will always be grateful for the life I have thanks to your service. I look forward to hearing from you soon. Yours, Susan. Susan folded the letter to get it ready to post. She still wondered what had happened to leave Harriet a widow at such a young age. And why did she limp? She knew they were questions she'd never be able to ask. She did hope her friend found happiness, though. It was sad to see such a pretty woman devote her life to others' happiness and never find a true love of her own. Someday, she hoped to receive a letter telling her Harriet had found love.